Hi everyone. So you've probably heard countless planty YouTubers, including myself out there, tell you that Calathea, technically reclassified now as Gopurtia, just a reminder, cannot be propagated via cuttings in water, but rather only via division. Well, if that's the case, how is it that over the last month I was successfully able to propagate not one, not two, not three, but 4 Calathea via cuttings in water? Well, to understand this, let's first talk about why people say it can't be done and also what the process of propagating these plants by division really is. So the main reason people say it can't be done is because water propagation typically requires a node. And I say typically because there are plants out there that you can successfully propagate in water via just a leaf cutting, but Calathea are not one of those plants. So if we actually take a look at my Calathea ornata here, you will notice that there are no visible nodes anywhere on this plant. I'll rotate it back this way for you so you can see the petioles back here as well. So yeah, no visible nodes anywhere on this plant. Now that might lead you to think, well, do Calathea just not have nodes? No, Calathea have nodes. All of your houseplants have nodes, you guys. They're just more obvious on some plants than on others. So just a reminder, Calathea are rhizome-based plants. So the stem of a Calathea, let me show you this one more time, for reference, so you might call this a stem. This is not actually a stem, this is a petiole. This connects the leaf to the stem, and because this is a rhizome-based plant, the stem is actually underneath the soil. So just a reminder that a rhizome is just a modified stem that grows underground. And because it grows underground, what happens is, as that stem grows underneath the soil, where the auxiliary buds are that produce leaves, they will root underneath the stem down into the soil, and they will send that leaf up from the top side of that stem of that rhizome. That is how these plants grow, and that is why it is typically easiest to propagate them via division, because basically what you're doing with division is you're just cutting the stem just like you would, for example, on a vining plant such as a philodendron. If you wanted to go propagate it, you would cut it, you would put the nodes into water or into soil, and you would wait for them to root. So you're doing the same thing on a Calathea, but it's just the stem itself is underneath the soil, and because it's underneath the soil, it's already got roots. So when you go to cut it and cut a node off, that node is really almost always just going to be already an established plant. Even if it doesn't have a leaf yet, it typically will already have roots. It will have the start of an auxiliary bud on the other side above where those roots are, and you can just take it, pot it up separately, and it will start to grow. So that's why there's no need, even when you are dividing it and cutting those nodes and separating them from underneath the soil, there's no need to put it into water because it's typically already completely rooted. So now you're probably really wondering, how on earth was it that I was able to make this happen? Well, to answer that question, we actually need to go back to January 1st of this year, when I discovered that my Calathea warskawesii had decided to start flowering. And the way the flowers came in on my Calathea warskawesii actually are different from any of the other flowers that have occurred on any of my other Calathea. It actually shot up a very long shoot. It put out 2 leaves that looked very similar to the regular leaves on the plant, and in between those 2 leaves is where this beautiful tiny little white flower emerged. Now it did this in 4 separate places on the plant, and I let it flower, and then as the flowers got spent, I went ahead and I cut the flower part off, but I ended up deciding to leave the 2 leaves that were there because it didn't look bad, and so I was like, all right, well, I'm just gonna leave it there for now, maybe I'll cut it off later. Well, after that, it continued to develop new leaves from where those 2 leaves were and where I'd removed that flower. And it kind of helped fill in the plant a little bit, so I left it that way. I left it that way for a long, long time. But then in the last month, because it had developed so many leaves off of that very long shoot that had no leaves further down, all 4 of those started to get very top heavy and started to be kind of like bending and flopping over. And at a certain point, I'm sure they probably would have snapped off. But in the meantime, before we got to that point, I had been looking at the bract there and thinking to myself, that looks an awful lot like a node. It looks an awful lot like a node, And because it looks like a node, I feel like you should be able to propagate it in water. So I already had this thought brewing in the back of my brain. And then when they got too top heavy and were kind of folding over, I was like, well, I might as well just give it a go. So I went ahead and I cut each of those shoots off at the base of the plant. I then cut the very long extra part of that shoot off, so I just had about an inch below the node, or what looked like a node to me. I then made sure to remove all of the old dried petiole sheathings from the cutting because I didn't want those to rot away in the water and potentially cause a rot problem with the entire propagation. I then popped that into some water and I waited. And about a week and a half to 2 weeks later, I had a ton of roots. It happened that quickly, guys. A lot of roots formed very, very quickly. So at that point, I went ahead and I potted this up just into my forest floor mix because that is what I prefer to use for my Calathea nowadays. I find that they really prefer it. That's what the mama plant is planted in. So I got this all potted up and now here we are. And we are still alive and happy. We have still been producing new leaves. So this is now a successful little Calathea warskawesii that grew from a propagation that was cut from the mother plant and put into water. So at this point, you might be wondering why it is that nobody ever seems to talk about this. Why doesn't anybody talk about the fact that this can be done? And also you might be wondering, can you do this with every single type of Calathea? And the answer to the second question is no, you cannot do this with every single type of Calathea, and that is likely probably why not many people talk about this. So why can't we do this with every type of Calathea? Well, in order to understand that, we first need to talk about flower bracts. So once again, part of the reason that I suspected that this might work with the Calathea warskawesii is because of how that flower bract looked. So Calathea warskawesii do have what is referred to as a leafy flower bract or a foliaceous bract. But what that basically means is that the bract has leaves. Technically, they're modified leaves. Every flower bract is modified leaves by definition. But in the case of a leafy bract, or aka foliaceous, it's a hard word for me to say today, you guys, but foliaceous bract, the bract itself actually looks like the leaves of the plant. The only real difference is that they typically come in and grow a little bit smaller than the main leaves on the plant, and that was the case with the bracts on this Calathea warskawesii. And not only was it the fact that the bract looked like leaves, it was also the fact that after I removed the flower that it continued to put out new leaves where those two original leaves on the bract were. That made me think that this would be successful. Now there are all kinds of different types of bracts. I think there's about 8 different ones. I'm not going to get into all of that in today's video, but not all Calathea flower in the same manner. And honestly, you guys, not all flowers have bracts. It's just a fact. But for example, we have seen before that my Calathea Freddy has a flowering problem. He does. He just has a serious flowering problem, you guys. I really hoped this spring and summer he wasn't going to flower the entire time again, but that's what he's been doing. He's been flowering the entire time again. But in the case of the flowers on my Calathea Freddy, as you can see here, they come in a very tight knit at the base of those petioles and the top of the soil, tightly packed in there. And honestly, it's hard to tell if they even have something that resembles a node. I can't really even get in there very well to try and cut one off. They usually just kind of pop off. So that there tells me that that is not going to be something I can do with the flowers on a Calathea Freddy. Now, other Calatheas do have flowers that come in tight at the base like that. Some of them are not quite as tight. For example, I think it's the Calathea orbifolia. They kind of start to come out the way the leaves come out, but they don't seem to have what is as obvious of a node as what we saw on the Calathea warskawesii. And don't even get me started, you guys, on the different flower patterns and why do some of the Calathea have flowers that come in on giant shoots like we see on the warskawesii versus what I just showed you on the orbifolia and the Calathea Freddy. That goes way back to the history of how these plants were classified. A lot of them were previously classified and currently classified based on the type of flowers that they have. And like I said, technically they've all been reclassified now as Copertia. I will save that whole breakdown of all the subgenre and everything else for these plants for another video. But just know there's a lot of different ways that these plants can flower. But I have successfully been able to prove that for Calathea that flower in the manner of the Calathea warskawesii, I do believe the Calathea zebrina flowers in the same manner as well. For these plants, if you do get flowers, you can then propagate them into new little plants from that flower bract once that flower is spent. Now, even if a flower on a Calathea comes in and it does not exactly look like it has leaves like this, just a reminder, like I said, flower bracts are modified leaves. Every type of flower bract is some form of modified leaf. So it stands to reason that even if it doesn't look like the leaves of the plant, it could potentially still be done. So for example, I found this picture, and I don't remember if it said exactly what type of Calathea this is. If I can figure it out, I'll flash it on screen for you. But as you can see, this bract does not have leaves that look like the plant. However, it does kind of look like it still has a node at the base of that bract. So I have a hunch that you could potentially have it work with a plant that flowers this way as well, but the only way to know for sure would be to actually try it. And I'm actually curious to know if anybody else out there has tried this with a Calathea warska before, or a different type of Calathea such as the one I just showed you, and if it worked for you as well. So please comment down below and let us know. But in general, I feel like we can no longer really go around saying that Calathea can't be propagated via cuttings in water and can only ever be propagated by division, because clearly I have proven that wrong. So I will say still that in general, your best bet is going to be propagation by division, because who knows when your plant is going to flower, if it will ever flower. But if it does, this definitely was way easier than propagation by division. You don't have to deal with the mess of taking the plant out of the pot, working dirt off to find a place to cut, etc. But I hope you guys have found this video interesting today. Hopefully you have learned a thing or two. If you have enjoyed this video, please be sure to click that like and/or subscribe button down below, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Aloha!